Welcome, everyone, to what I would argue is one of the most or the most important panel of our summit, Rebalancing Home Life. This is a topic that we have been discussing throughout many, many years, whether it's for our customers who are juggling as entrepreneurs or at work, and certainly for our own employees in terms of balancing all our responsibilities. Certainly, we've seen that the pandemic has helped uncover this need to really rebalance work and life. And it has helped shed light on the fact that work and life are not separate. They're interconnected areas that impact one another. But the issues were always there. We found a really interesting survey by the ILO and Gallup of 149,000 respondents, which was conducted in 142 countries back in 2017. And they found that balancing work and family is the top challenge for women at work globally. This was consistent across every single region of the world. So today we have a phenomenal group of panelists for you to discuss the recent trends on balancing home life, how things have evolved since the pandemic, but also what institutions can do to support both women and men to rebalance their work and life. It's also a personal issue for all of us, so we will certainly get a little bit personal with our panelists and we'll ask them to share some of their suggestions. So first, I would like to introduce you to our phenomenal group of panelists. First, we have Eve Rotsky, author of the New York Times bestselling book, Fair Play, a life management system to help partners rebalance their work and life. She's also, I find super interesting, both an economist and a lawyer by training, which I always find very impressive. And she's worked in the financial services. So we're so happy to have you. We also have Felicity Duffy, who's the head of Women's Markets, Foundations, and Customer Advocacy at Westpac. Felicity has almost 20 years of experience working in the financial services sector and has worked across a variety of leadership roles alongside Westpac executives. Since 2017, she has led Women's Markets at Westpac, which really, as you all know, is the gold standard in becoming both the employer and bank of choice for women. And finally, we have Stephen Puig, CEO of Banco VH de Leon in the Dominican Republic. Steve has worked at executive roles in banks all around Latin America and has been leading VH de Leon for the last 8 years. But most importantly for us, he has been a champion for gender and recognized both in the DR and worldwide for policies and for their amazing gender program. So welcome, everybody. So I wanted to start with you, Eve, and really focusing on your book and the research that you did for Fair Play, where you surveyed couples across the US to really figure out how to structure home life more effectively. So can you tell us a little bit about the research and what did you find in terms of the distribution of labor?
Well, actually, it was 17 countries. I have data from 17 countries. And I did not set out, even though I think you had such a beautiful introduction to the law and economics background that I have, but I did not set out to be a gendered division of labor specialist. That was not on my third grade, what do you want to be when you grow up list. I think it was like astronaut and dancer. But what happened to me was my husband sent me a text after my second son was born that just said, "I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries." And "I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries" text led me to a 10-year journey to where I was. But what I want to just unpack for 60 seconds is what was happening as I was texting and driving that day. I had just opted out of the traditional workforce. I put opted out in quotes because now I say forced out. If there's any woman that was in the corporate workforce that is not there, it's probably because a manager or a C-suite or a culture forced her out of that job. But I thought back then I had opted out, that it was a choice. And at that, I also had a breast pump and a diaper bag on the passenger seat of my car. I had gifts for a newborn baby to return in the back seat of my car. I had a client contract in my lap. And because I'd started my own firm, because a lot of women become entrepreneurs after they get kicked out of the traditional workforce, which hurts our economic security and also means that we're not in those C-suites that we need to be in. We're not the decision makers where we should be. And I remember the pen would sort of stab me between the legs as I was hitting the brakes because I was racing to get my older son, Zach, at his toddler transition program. And in America, those programs last about 10 minutes and they cost our entire salary. So that was the chaos that was happening when Seth decided to send me a text. "I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries." And then I just started sobbing on the side of the road. I pulled over, which we don't do lightly in LA because of traffic. But I remember sitting there thinking, this is not the career marriage combo I thought I was going to have, not even close to it. And how had I become the default, or as I call in fair play, the she-fault, for literally every single household and domestic task for my family? And then because I became awakened to this issue, I started seeing this happening all over. Every single demographic was reckoning with this issue. And this is before the pandemic, of the fact that our societies have been built on the backs of the unpaid labor of women. And our feminism to this date has been to say, well, if you want to get ahead, you can just outsource to another woman who's often Black or brown. And I found it extremely problematic. So instead of, divorcing my husband for being the fulfiller of his smoothie needs, I started to ask the most important question I've asked in the past 10 years that we can unpack later. But that was, what if we treated our homes as our most important organizations? One woman said, well, I know it wouldn't look like my house where we wait to decide who's taking the dog out, right, when it's about to take a piss on the rug. We are drowning in decision fatigue in the home. But if we treated our homes with some respect and rigor, like we treat our workplaces, what I realized was that not only could we use, like I like to say, the positive organizational scholarship, all the data that we know that works for psychological safety in an organization, but we would get to a place of more equity for women. And that's ultimately what I decided to research and write about over the past decade. And now Seth proudly gets the blueberries, and he also is very proud of my book, even though it portrays him in a terrible light.
So in their research, were there any findings that really surprised you that you did not expect?
Three things that kept me up at night. One is that, and this is an American statistic, but that 70% of the 1% in our country, the people whose lived experience are making our policies in corporations and in government, are white men with stay-at-home wives. That was shocking to me. The other thing that was shocking to me is that 75% of our pay gap is the motherhood penalty, is the bias against working mothers. And finally, I think the thing that surprised me the most was that we still to this day consider these private issues. The home is so dangerous, Rebecca, because we're saying things like, one man who looked like Steven said to me he was getting a divorce because of a glue stick. And he said that from White Plains, New York. And we can unpack that in a different panel. But I'm sitting there crying over off-season blueberries. The home is very dangerous because it presents so small. So you think you're fighting over a sponge in the sink and not over 100 years of conditioning so that women's economic security comes last. So I think having to make that personal to political connection, personal to workplace leadership connection was the hardest for me because of how dangerous the home presents. It presents, like I said, as a fight over who's taking the dog out before it takes a piss on the rug.
So Felicity, I'm sure there's a lot you can relate to in what Eve has said. But can you tell us a little bit about the reality in Australia and how do you relate to some of these findings?
Yeah, well, thanks. I've had so many emotions as you've been going through that, Eve. Mine was a birthday cake, and we were driving to school and I'd forgotten to organise the birthday cake for the school, even though I had the birthday cake sorted and the party sorted. And my husband was in the car with me and I burst into tears going, oh my God, I forgot the birthday cake. And sometimes I've got to see that to help. So thank God for the cheesecake shop because that fixed the birthday cake problem. And there's always the trigger. I think everyone has one of them. I think here in Australia we have the same scenario playing out. What has been interesting when we talk about the home is that the pandemic has brought many people's homes to the forefront of what's going on. And as we've discussed in the setup, we never know what might walk through the door at any moment in time. And I think that's been an incredibly important component of showing the family what actually goes on. So how does that dishwasher get unpacked? How does that washing get done? Who's worried about, is there milk in the fridge, which has been another one. So I think it's a global issue, and it's an important one, and maybe a silver lining of the pandemic, that it has allowed us to see more into the homes as to what is going on. Eve, I'm probably a little different in that I managed to stay within the corporate that I worked for. And, we'll probably come to this as well, but I feel very fortunate of the ever-changing policies around leave, because I think that those policies have grown over time at the same rate as my needs within the organisation have grown as well. So it's good that there are some, shows the importance of those policies, I think, within large corporates and what they're doing.
So I wanted to turn to you, Stephen, and, looking at the Dominican Republic and sort of a more conservative society, do some of these findings resonate with you as well as with some of your women employees at the bank?
Thanks, Rebecca. Yes, totally. I think a lot of these things are actually universal. I remember when we began developing our program about 6 or 7 years ago, 7 years ago now. One of the things that we found is that 80% of women in the Dominican Republic are responsible for most household purchase decisions, blueberries and all, as Eve was saying. And in addition to that, women here are typically responsible for things that are very important in the household, such as education, also health, not only for themselves, but for their partner as well as their kids. And not only that, but also for their parents, since we tend to have extended families here. We're not as nuclear as you might be in the US and probably in Australia. But healthcare as well. And in addition to that, just general well-being for the family. So there was clear evidence in the months that we spent researching what could be valuable for women in our value propositions, where we found similar findings that are very similar to what Eve and Felicity were describing.
So I wanted to turn it a little bit into what can employers do to really support women with, this heavy loads. And Felicity, I wanted to turn it back to you. And, in some of the research, we found that a lot of the employers have really just focused on, maternity leaves, adoption events. But in reality, most employees are really burdened by the day-to-day issues, right? The blueberries or the elder parents, like what Stephen is saying. So can you tell us a little bit about what Westpac is doing to really help their women and their men employees rebalance their home life?
Yeah, I think our journey started a while ago as well, and a very bold move. I was trying to think of the exact time, and I was measuring actually against the birth of my children. But I think it was probably about 8 years ago that the organisation stepped forward and said, all roles are flexible. So that's the starting point. You didn't have to go in and justify why you could do your job part-time. All jobs needed to come in and have this view of being flexible. Now, sometimes that flexible was about being part-time. Sometimes it's about start and finish times. Sometimes it's about being able to buy more leave in order to be able to have leave during the school holidays. But that shift of all roles flex was an incredibly important moment. But that's a policy. So it's only as good as then that you feel safe and secure to be actually able to use the policy. So first step was the policy, but the second step was the importance of leadership's training and also a lot of storytelling, particularly from senior leaders, to say how they are making their role flex. And I think we've now, as we've progressed over time, it still needs that storytelling and it still needs that training and reminder that all roles are flexible. But I think that has been a really important turning point. I think there's other leave, we've looked at other leave as well. One I'm really passionate about is this sense of parental leave, because I think if you can give partners the time to take in that care scenario, all of a sudden someone else does have to think about the blueberries and someone else does have to think about mine was always milk in the fridge. So we've been extending that leave, which has just been extended to 16 weeks, which has been an important one. We've also been looking at, and this happened many years ago, but for me it became really personal last year, which is the fact that our accruing sick leave can be used for carers leave. And I had to have a number of months off last year as my son was unwell, and to just have that access to what was carers leave. I didn't have to feel guilty. It was very clear why I was taking it. And I think it's these sorts of things that are beyond just the birth and the recognition that care goes on for a long time. And that carers leave can be used for children, family, friends. And I think that's a really important one. We've also introduced things like grandparents' leave, which I think is another important component, where grandparents can take that opportunity to have that time and support actually their families in caring for their children as well, and don't necessarily then have to feel the need to retire in order to play that grandparent role. And another policy that we've just introduced recently, which I think is an important one, and again, actually I have a personal experience of it within the organisation, is early pregnancy loss. And that is something that's often sort of swept under the carpet and not discussed, and you probably used your sick leave in order to deal with it, but it's actually an important leave that needs to be available to both men and women. And we'll continue to keep looking for the importance of the sorts of policies around flex and leave that adapt to the needs of our employees more broadly.
That's fantastic. And so great to hear, there's certain stigma to some of these moments that I think if a company is recognizing them, it really helps. I think all employees just go through them. So I wanted to turn it back to you, Stephen, in terms of some of the work that you have done at DHD Leon. And one of the things I'm most really impressed is you were the first company in the DR to have a paternity leave for male employees, and you didn't have to do this. Nobody mandated it. So why was it important for the bank to do this?
I think it was important for a number of things. I remember when we announced it at a large Christmas event. There are about 5,000 employees at Banco BHD Leon, and we were all there. Our gender composition overall is about 62% women and the balance men in our organization. And I remember that when I announced it, there was resounding applause from the men who were in the room. In our case, at that time, the law stipulated 2 days for men in the country, and we were taking it to 10 days. We realized that in Northern Europe and many other places, this is much longer, right? But this was a significant change here. Eventually, the government here took it to 5 days, from 2 days to 5 days. But we were at 10 when it was 2 days by law. And what I was going to say is that what impressed me the most was that the women in the room applauded even more loudly than the men. And I think it just went to show that by taking measures such as this, it really got to all of our employees, not just the men, but also the women, that we were serious about shared responsibilities in terms of their personal lives. And I think that's what the real relevance was of that, and the motivation was not just the time, but also the message to our organization. And this was something that was reported widely outside of our organization as well. So, it sent a message also to our customer base and to the country in general that we were serious about what we were doing.
Absolutely. So I wanted to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the pandemic and how things have evolved. And so, Eve, going back to you, we've seen that many employers were really unaware of the extent to which employees were burdened by care. So how have you seen the response and from employers really in terms of really supporting them throughout the pandemic and hopefully afterwards as well?
Yes.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. This was for Eve. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eve.
We have the same name. I think it was for you. Go.
Okay. I guess we rhyme, Steve and Eve. But in our case, during the pandemic and the topic of home care, what we've tried to do first and foremost is to be conscious of each employee situation. So we've tried to have our managers be well aware of what the specific situation is of the folks that work with them. And to this day, this is what's continued. We haven't made a broad mandate, to tell people you must be back by October 1st or whatever date. We haven't done that because we're trying to be mindful of the situations that each person has at home. Our offices are open. Everyone's welcome to come back. I was saying before we started this session that, I go into the office now almost daily, and usually if I have time between meetings, I'll come and complete my day from home. But I think that the most important thing was mindfulness. The other thing that we did was basically provide support. We provided support in terms of economic support, i.e. to set up home offices, in terms of benefits that were previously being used for things such as gasoline and whatnot. We converted those into benefits that could be used to set up and work more productively from home. We also provided support in terms of healthcare. We obtained medical resources and had a dedicated doctor, actually more than one, a couple of dedicated doctors to help our families through the pandemic. And we also had a hotline that was previously used for other types of issues that our employees might have, but that was opened up to deal with anything that anyone might have in terms of the pandemic as well. So those were the kinds of things that we focused on.
Thank you. So Eve, I will ask you the same question, but add, do you think this sort of additional support is here to stay? Or is it a one-off?
Yeah, I think what Felicity was saying earlier is true, that there's something really, the silver lining of the pandemic was being able to see into people's homes. We're all that BBC dad, if you remember that dad who had the toddler walk into his that viral meme where he's like throwing them out. We've all sort of become that. I will say that one interesting thing about, which I really want to give kudos to Felicity and Stephen as I talk to organizations, especially in the US, about what they can do, is that there's a really interesting stat that women's incomes increase by 7% for every month men take paternity leave. So it's a really, so thank you for that. And so what do I think happened in the pandemic? Well, I think a lot of things happened. One, I remember in 2016, when I wanted to talk about women being on the edge, one crisis away from leaving the workforce, a lot of publishers said to me, well, we don't need your book. We don't need to relitigate the 90s. Work-life balance is not really the issue anymore. Women are in the labor force more than men. And I remember going to Davos and saying that I still thought this was a really big issue. This was in March 2020. And I do remember one German politician came out to me and said, well, the thing is, you don't really have to litigate against women, right? You don't have to really actively discriminate against women. You could do, and this is a progressive politician talking about some policies that they had in Munich. You could just require that kids have to come home for lunch. And then you can watch labor force participation rates drop. So what just happened over the past 18 months is we just had a big global experiment in requiring kids to come home for lunch, basically. And we've watched labor force participation rates drop over 30 years. In addition, we saw, and I love this, I keep my Post-its here, but we saw 153% increase in unpaid labor for women, and men did not take on any of the increased burden. And that was very common in all the countries and all the women that were reaching out to me saying, my partner shut himself into a room because he can't be bothered. And I'm trying to work with a child on my lap in the bathtub. So I don't think that anything was going to be changed just by seeing it. But as I like to say, we go from pre-consciousness to consciousness to a fight for solutions. So the fact that we're even having this panel is a huge win, because we had to fight just to get to have a little mini panel in Davos about work-life integration that was considered a passé topic. And now these conversations are exploding. And then you see leaders like Stephen and Felicity and some really innovative policies. So the last thing I will say is that what Stephen and Felicity, what you're doing is extremely innovative. The two most innovative things I'm seeing are a change in the default of policies like organ donation. So you have to opt in and use it or lose it for paternity leave. So many leaders used to say, you'd be so proud of me, Eve. I'm asking if my male employees are taking paternity leave. And I'd say that's a terrible question. It's not if, it's when. So I'm getting a lot more when right now, which is very exciting what I'm seeing in the data. And the other thing I would say is it's exactly as Felicity said, understanding that flex is not work from home. Equating flexibility with work from home is very dangerous. Flexibility comes in many different ways, like setting, as you said, setting your schedule, the days you work, possibly being able to job share, being able to take extended leave. So there's many ways to look at flexibility. Work from home is not just that, because you can still be a butt in a chair for 15 hours. So I do think we're at the forefront of huge changes that probably would have taken 20 or 30 years if it wasn't for the pandemic.
Absolutely. I wanted to turn a little bit to the role of fathers. And, Felicity, you were talking a little bit about that storytelling. And I thought it was really interesting, Stephen, when Banco BH de León launched an internal communications campaign with your male employees. And I was actually getting a little bit teary-eyed watching them. It was just, it's basically them just talking about being fathers. So can you tell us a little bit about that campaign, its impact, and what was the thinking behind the campaign?
Sure. Yeah, that was a campaign which, in retrospect, had the groups been mixed in terms of male employees and female employees, it wouldn't have had the same impact. But these were just guys sitting around a table talking about what it was like to be a father and the responsibilities that they felt. And it's something that I think it came across as a unique vignette of what men are actually capable of speaking between themselves if they're locked in a room. Yet it's not something that's commonly portrayed or portrayed that often, I would say. So it was something that I think actually it was touching, I think is the word, for everybody in our organization. And it showed something that we had tried to promote since we began our program, which is that we wanted to get the guys in our organization as involved as the women in our gender program. And that's why we signed up for He for She, for example, which the UN promotes. And this was something along those lines. We wanted to continue to promote, the consciousness that Eve mentioned in terms of, what roles men can and should assume and what might actually get said behind closed doors when they're talking among themselves, or we're talking among ourselves.
Absolutely. And I wanted to turn a little bit about and discuss the role of government in all this, because we've been talking about, employers and what the private sector can do. And during the first day of the summit, we discussed the UK Code for Investing in Women in really creating an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And what I found most interesting about that research is that the first barrier that women entrepreneurs have mentioned is access to capital. But the second one, and what's holding them back, is really childcare and care responsibilities at home. So it's no longer just about the capital. It's no longer just about getting entrepreneurs on, but really helping them with their work-life balance. And so I'll start, Felicity, with you first in terms of where do you think the role of the private sector ends and the role of the government begins in supporting families?
I think we've been able to see the role of the private sector as the agitator to actually support for the change of policy. So for Westpac, we were one of the first organisations to introduce paid maternity leave. And I always say to the leader in the bank who drove that, I wouldn't be able to be doing what I'm doing today if you had not driven that, because I've now got a 15, 13-year-old and a 10-year-old and been able to make use of many of those leave opportunities that we had. But I was also able to be paid for the sort of 3 months of that time that was really important to my family's position. So by the organisation leading the way in that well over 15 years ago, that then has helped to set standards across many other organisations. So I think we should never underestimate our role as the agitator on those sorts of things. Another example for us is around paid super, and we know the impact of women and the caring responsibilities on their super. So I think continuing to find those roles of opportunity of agitation are really important. We then need to look into our own policies and our settings for women in accessing capital, as we've kind of talked about, and the impacts on families that occur. And so how can the bank support with that in regard to potentially things like loan holidays, or payment holidays on loans, and also, fee changes, and also looking at how we're actually looking at the serviceability of loans when people are on maternity or paternity leave. So often we look at those levers on more the consumer side, and what I've loved seeing from the UK is how they're turning some of those views now to actually policies and settings on the business side. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to be looking at those as well.
On your perspective, Eve, in terms of the role of government, where do you think that starts, or where do you think that ends?
Well, why I'm a lawyer is because I always find it funny that there's this new discipline called like design thinking, because there's nobody who designs societies more than lawyers, right? If you want people to stop at a stop sign, you're going to pass a law that you're supposed to stop at that stop sign. You don't want people to vote, you're going to pass a law that increases voter restrictions, as we saw in Georgia and in America. So I think of laws as extremely important to how we design society. So to me, government is really three things. It's what we measure. So if you think of Peter Drucker, like you can't manage what you can't measure. The data that comes out of our government, our time use surveys, what we measure, how we design our laws, and also what we choose to fund are all, to me, intertwined. And you really can't do that on a major scale unless you have, in our country, at least in America, federal and state support for these policies. We get two bites of the apples because we have state laws and federal laws and different budgets based on the municipalities. So I think government has a huge role to play. We've completely abdicated that role, particularly in America, because of rhetoric, I believe, that started in the 80s, which was that government was not your friend, it was your enemy. And I think that corporations have had to have a huge burden. And so what I always say to corporate leaders is, I'm sorry you've had to carry this burden alone. I'm sorry for startup entrepreneurs who say, I want to walk the walk and get paid leave for my employees, but my venture capital won't let me spend my money on paid leave for my employees. These are decisions we shouldn't have to make. And the safety net that we have, especially in America, is not there. So you just literally, you jump, you fall on cement here. And so I just think that we have to really think about what is the softer landing we want? If we can't create wealth, we have these wealth disparities. If you don't want to completely tax and redistribute wealth, you want to stay in a capitalist society, you better have a softer landing for people, which includes access to paid leave, free childcare, and to me, including unpaid labor in your gross domestic product.
And I'll turn it to Steve for your perspective, but also, as the CEO of a bank, what can leaders do to really work together with government and have a more ecosystem approach? So it's not just the private sector carrying all the weight.
Sure. Well, this is actually a very opportune question for us in the context of not just our organization, but our country, because there's an initiative called the Gender Parity Initiative, which emanates from the World Economic Foundation, which puts on Davos, where Eve spoke. And the Gender Parity Initiative, its objective is precisely to get the public sector and the private sector working together to create greater gender equity. And we've been engaged in this dialogue with our government here. We're part of we're fortunate to be one of the few selected companies to develop this the initial part here with our government at the highest level. This is something that's coming from the presidency of our country. And what we've seen is basically that there's room for both of us to work together. I think companies such as ours that have been working on this topic see clear opportunities. Just to give a small example, one of the things I always harp on, and Eve is constantly mentioning in this presentation today, is the importance of data. And, in our country, we have a great opportunity with the government to make sure that companies such as ourselves provide publicly gender disaggregated data, i.e. in terms of our loan experience, in terms of delinquencies, et cetera. And to the extent that the government requires that from players such as ourselves, I mean, we do it for ourselves because we have the initiative and we've learned from this a lot. And we actually make credit decisions based on what we've learned. But it would be useful if others had, once they begin producing the data, I'm certain they'll begin using it as well to make decisions that would benefit women who have loan needs, whether it's for a personal basis or for entrepreneurial needs that they might have as well. But here, what I've seen is basically that there's no one size fits all solution. So I think the role of government is basically to create the incentives so that companies can take the initiatives that they need to take to provide solutions for their workforces, because it's not the same. It's not the same solution for us is not necessarily going to be the same for a company that manufactures textiles for export, which may not be the same solution for a company that's in the service industry. So I think to the extent that we have incentives that allow us to adapt things that would work for us. And here I'm thinking, for example, of things such as daycare. We would love to establish a daycare center. That requires an investment. And to the extent that investment can be recognized, we would love to do that. To the extent it also involves responsibility, which is something when you start talking about daycare, everybody would love to offer daycare, yet the responsibility is very substantial. And it's easier said than done. To the extent that there could be, for example, clear rules on creating standards for daycare, on creating certification for those persons that would work there, and establish clear responsibilities, i.e. in terms of the corporation vis-a-vis the kids that would be there and others that would be involved with the daycare. I think that would be very helpful as well. So I see a lot of room to work together, and it happens to be something that we're currently engaged with here in the DR.
Excellent. So for our last question, we have a couple minutes left. I did promise we were going to get personal. So we'll ask each one of you, what suggestion would you give our audience to really try to rebalance their home life during the pandemic? Felicity, I'll start with you because you're right in the middle of lockdown.
We are. So I would definitely, I think there's a reason on planes when we used to go on them that they say pull down your mask first. Before you put it on your children or others that you're caring for. And I sometimes, particularly, you can find it hard to focus on yourself. And I think it is super important at the moment to be focused on that. For me, the solution was to set myself a bit of a goal on those steps every day and getting out, morning, noon and night to be able to do that. And I think the other thing is, don't try to be perfect. I've sat here worried while we've been doing this about who's going to walk through the door or what's going to happen. The doorbell went at one stage. And I think that's such an important message. Just be authentic about what's going on. It's okay to not be okay. And it's important that you create a safe environment for your team members to feel like they can say, I'm just not okay today. It's not going well. So
Stephen, what suggestions would you have?
For me? Okay, thank you. I think communication is essential. And I think that communication is important in normal times, and in abnormal times such as these, it's even more important. So, when I think back to what we've done here at home, basically we try to communicate every day, like, what's your schedule like today? What's mine? How can we balance this out something that I know Eve emphasizes a lot in her work is be fair in terms of how you distribute stuff. You know, who's cooking today? Are we going to get together for lunch? Can we exercise together today? Just stuff like that on a daily basis. And then not just communicating on a day-to-day basis, but also on a longer-term basis. I have to admit that my partner, she's better at planning than I am. Our calendars. She knows every date between now and January and where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing. But although she has that, you know, obviously we try to share what we do in terms of preparing for those dates and the things that we have in common with the family.
And Eve, I'll give you the last word.
The last word is just that, especially for women out there, you have a permission to be unavailable from your roles. And I think that this idea that there's no permission to be unavailable and that all your time has to be in service of either your role as a parent, a partner, and or a professional is just wrong. You deserve permission, uninterrupted attention for things that you love that are unpaid, whether it's knitting, whether it's gravel cycling, or for me, it's hip hop dance. Take that time, especially on the weekend. Your partner, if you're lucky and privileged enough to have one, and your community, you build one to support you to do that.
So thank you all so much for this amazing panel. I wish I could stay here and keep asking you questions. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I'll remind everyone what Eve just said. You have the permission to be unavailable. Thank you.